Well, today we're going to talk about rent seeking, and then we're going to talk about bureaucracy. And in the rent seeking, have some articles in the folder 8. One is Tulloch's paper, sort of the foundation paper on rent seeking. 2 is a chapter from Bob Tollison's book on rent seeking. And 3, a 1996 survey of the literature, so that you have some things to read and take a look at as well. Traditionally, when we talk about rent, we're talking about a return to the resources which are in fixed supply. So it started out with land. So the idea of land might be in a fixed supply. So anything that is a return to that is in excess of what it really needs to be provided. So we started talking about rent as something, as a sort of an economic profit that's not necessary to bring the supply out, with the idea that land's fixed in supply, you can't do anything with it. Of course, we know that you can alter the amount of land that you use for different things, and we can maybe, if you wanted to, you could build a lake, or by damming up water, you can change the usage of land. So land for the use of something can vary, but nonetheless, that's what we were starting out with, the idea that land is a return to a resource that's rent is a return to resources in a fixed supply. And then it started to broaden out, and we began to talk about monopoly rents. So anything that's in excess of the perfect competition would be called rent. So we talk about monopoly profit, but sometimes we talked about monopoly rent. And so if we have government out there and it can create barriers to entry and create a monopoly, then the return from that, Gordon Tulloch called rent. And so, for example, let's say we have a remember that if we have a demand curve for a monopolist, if you think back to that, and the monopolist has a marginal revenue curve that's here and a marginal cost curve that's there, and recall that you could have that the average total cost curve could look something like this. And so the monopolist is going to be producing where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is there. And so that's the quantity that the monopolist would be producing. And notice that the price is up here and the average total cost is there. So this amount would be profit, right? And of course, in a competitive market, what did you have? That if firms make economic profit, other firms will enter the industry, shifting the supply curve out for the industry, driving the price down until the economic profit went to zero. But if I could make it so that you can't compete against me, if I have something that creates barriers to entry, then I can create economic rent or monopoly profit. And again, Gordon Tulloch talked about that as economic rent. And it may not have to create just a monopoly. The fact that it can restrict entry means that if there were 3 firms and they were making economic profit, what we would expect to happen in a perfectly competitive market, other firms enter, drive the supply curve out, prices go down, go to economic profit equals 0. If I can keep other firms from entering, then I can result in economic profit being sustained over a period of time. So well, just as an example of this, if we look at the steel tariffs that the Trump administration put in, what was the idea there? The idea there is to put a tax on anybody that uses, let's say, Chinese steel. And so what will that happen? There will be less Chinese steel being used out there, which means that the domestic steel manufacturers are going to be able to have a higher price than they otherwise would be able to do. So we're restricting this entry of foreign steel into the United States, is allowing the domestic steel manufacturers to maintain an economic profit. So if we think about that, then what that's going to do is that's going to create what Tullock called economic rent. Tullock pointed out that what's going to happen is that firms will use resources up to capture these rents. That's sort of the main point that Tullock made. That is Gordon Tullock. He said, okay, firms use resources to gain the economic rent. So, for example, his point is that it's not a zero-sum game. That is, if what happened was we had something that created an increase in profit for the U.S. manufacturers, and that was equally offset by the decrease in profit by the Chinese steel manufacturers, it would be a zero-sum game. We're talking about, from game theory. What the winners are winning, the losers are losing. Okay? But Tullock points out that no, even if that happened, even if the profit that the U.S. steel manufacturers made was simply the loss in profit that happened with the Chinese steel manufacturers, firms are going to use up resources in order to gain this economic rent. And that means that it's a negative sum game. If you were to think about it, right? That creates a negative sum game. The losses to the losers exceed the gains to the winners. And so if we think about that a little bit, how much would you spend in order to, in terms of lobbying or in trying to rent seek, how much would you spend in order to get that economic rent? Well, what you'd have to do is, what we go back to what we've been talking about several times before, is we're going to look at expected value, right? We're going to take the probability times the value, right? So if, let's say I could make $500 in rent, and I got a 10% chance of getting that, if I hire a lobbyist, I got a 10% chance that I'm going to end up getting that thing passed, then what would happen? I would pay up to $50, right, in order to hire lobbyists in order to get this rent. But notice that I might not be the only firm that's out there trying to get that rent. There might be all sorts of other firms out there trying to get that rent. And so they'd all be hiring lobbyists, and they'd be willing to pay the expected value. That is, if I could get $500 in value from getting this bill passed, and I got a 10% chance of it getting passed if I hire public sector consultants, then what would happen is I'd be paying $50 to do that, but you would be doing the same thing, right? So if we sort of look at it, is that the main point that that Tullock is making is that rent seeking is a negative sum game. That is, if you allow the government to be out there being able to do things that will create rents or create profits for firms, then they're going to hire lobbyists in order to do that. And you get some unintended consequences of these things. If we, again, go back to from Econ 105, you have all sorts of unintended consequences. So, for example, in 2008, the Bush administration put on steel tariffs in order to protect the US steel industry. Well, what they weren't thinking was that this is going to affect the auto parts suppliers that are in the US. In fact, I got hired to do a little consulting work for the auto parts manufacturers to explain that, hey, guess what? If the Chinese auto parts manufacturers are able to buy Chinese steel, which is inexpensive, and I got to pay a tax on if I buy Chinese steel and I'm a US auto parts manufacturer, then the marginal cost to me of making auto parts is going to go up. And it's going up at such a rate that I'm getting outcompeted by the Chinese steel manufacturers. So in the end, what happened was they repealed the steel tariffs because of the auto parts manufacturers in the United States are being hurt rather extensively by these unintended consequences of the steel tariffs. Also, you get coalitions that form on this. For example, how about quotas on sugar? Now, we'll talk a little bit later on about rational ignorance, and if you've had Professor Clark's behavioral economics class, and probably talks a little bit, I'm going to guess, in intermediate micro, you know that people are oftentimes rationally ignorant of things. They don't really know what the laws are or what's going on in terms of the political process. Well, probably a lot of you don't know that there are quotas on sugar that can come into the United States. So why would the government put these quotas there? These quotas would be there because if what I do is I restrict the supply, what would happen? I have P and Q, so I got a demand for sugar and I got a supply of sugar, and I'm a domestic sugar producer, and I'm going at the world market price for sugar. Well, what you can do is, if I could restrict that supply of sugar, then what's going to happen is the price of sugar is going to go up in the United States. And so if I'm a domestic sugar producer, I'm going to be happy with that, right? I'm going to hire a lobbyist. If I could hire a lobbyist to go out there and restrict the supply of sugar, I'm going to do that. But notice that also who might be in favor of this is Archer Daniels Midland. Because Archer Daniels Midland, what do? They have all sorts of farms and the like, and what do they grow? They grow corn, okay? Now, what can you make from corn? You can make corn syrup. And that is a substitute for sugar. So if you're Archer Daniels Midland and you grow lots of corn, you're going to have a demand for corn go up, because what's going to happen is because I've raised the price of sugar, think back to Econ 105 or 202 or whatever. So I'm raising the price of a substitute, I'm going to increase the demand for corn syrup. But since corn is an input into corn syrup, I'm going to increase the demand for corn, and I'm going to drive up the price of corn. So it wouldn't be odd to see Archer Daniels Midland's lobbyist there with the sugar growers lobbyist from, let's say, the Michigan in the thumb area, they grow sugar beets, or people in Florida, that the big sugar growers down there in Florida. It wouldn't be odd to see their lobbyists coming together. But on the other side, what are you going to have? You got the lobbyists for Pepsi, right, and Coca-Cola, right, or any of the cereal manufacturers like Kellogg's. You know how you can remember how to spell Kellogg's. They used to have a commercial, and it would say, K-E-double-L-O double good, Kellogg's best for you. Okay, so anyway, so Kellogg's, what's going to happen? They use sugar. So their lobbyists will be out there debating with the ADM and the lobbyists for the sugar growers. Again, from Econ 105, you know, we talked about this as well when we read the Constitution of Liberty. One of the things that Hayek says is that one reason you might want to have democracy is because debate over the issues will advance the state of knowledge. Now, we, in 105, we talked about you guys would be rationally ignorant about this. So you might not know that the sugar quotas even exist, but the lobbyists do, and so they're going to debate one another. But the point here is that you could get all sorts of money being spent and all sorts of resources being used up trying to gain economic rents. That is, what Tulloch is saying is, okay, not only would I have the sugar growers out there trying to get monopoly rents for me, I'm going to have these guys spending resources to debate or to battle these people over here. So his point is that you have that rent seeking, right, is truly a negative sum game. It's inefficient, right, in terms of economic efficiencies. So that if what happens is, if we think back to, again, what Bastiat talked about in the law, and if those of you had 105, what did he say? He says, once the government engages in legalized plunder, which he defines both as taking from one person and giving to another, and if the law gives an advantage to one person over another, which is what this would be, he says that the plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law, right? So what would Bastiat say about this? He says, yeah, Tulloch, you got it right. Once the government can restrict the supply of sugar in order to provide monopoly rents to the sugar growers, then what's going to happen is the plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law. That is, we're going to hire lobbyists and rent seeking is going to happen. So how do you reduce rent seeking? The way to reduce rent seeking is to make it so that the government can't do such things. If you, I'll have a broad range of things that the government can do in terms of doing things which benefit one person over another, to generate economic rents for the person that they're benefiting, then that's going to lead to a waste of resources and a much larger use of resources than you might have thought about. One of the other things that you might think about is that within an organization, as again that we pointed out in 105 and Mises was talking about, within an organization, it may be difficult to keep all the people together once the government's in there trying to do stuff. And here's what I wasn't very clear about what I meant there, but here's what I mean. For example, if you are the lobbyist for the you're the lobbyist for the National Farm Bureau. And what you do is you say, okay, you know what? How can I increase the demand for my corn growers? I could do that by getting ethanol requirements in gasoline, saying that oil refiners have to put a certain percentage of ethanol in the gasoline, okay? Which is, we have a law that requires that. Okay? We have to use up so many gallons of ethanol in order to do that. But it's really corn ethanol because they have taxes on Brazilian ethanol coming in which is made from sugar cane. So the deal is to drive up the demand for corn by increasing a requirement that makes it so that people have to buy corn ethanol. Okay? That's fine for your corn growers, but what happens if within the National Farm Bureau you not only have corn growers, but you have cattle ranchers, right? And so what they're doing is when they take the cattle into the feedlot before they get sent off to the slaughterhouse, what are they feeding them? They're feeding them corn, okay? Or if you have dairy cattle, what do you feed them? You feed them corn. And so you're not going to be happy that the corn growers are getting this economic rent from the ethanol requirement because you are facing a higher input price because of that. So if you have a large lobbying group, it may be hard to make it so that you don't have part of your constituency wanting this thing, and it's going to cause problems for the other part. All right, so in summary, what rent seeking is about, it is, Gordon, what we're talking about here in terms of public choice, is that you have the government being able to provide an advantage to one person or to a group of companies or whatever. And so what will happen is the people will rent seek. That is, they will try to use the government in order to improve their economic situation. And the economic efficiency problem is that you're going to use up resources as you go out and try to rent seek. And so it isn't a matter of, gee, this isn't good because it's taken from this person and giving to another, right? It's not like stealing would be a zero-sum game, but you're using up resources on both sides trying to, perhaps get rent-seeking advantage for you, but the other people might be have a detriment from that, and they'll be spending, using up resources. So again, you can take a look in the folder, and we'll talk and have those 3 papers that you can read to get more background information if you like.